Okay, that's great, thanks. So everyone's okay on the taping, that is excellent. I've done the attendance list, which is also very good. I want to do 4 things today, 3 or 4. First talk a little bit about psychoanalysis in general. Then talk about psychoanalytic literary criticism. Then talk about the text for today, which is in German this one. Der Wahn und die Träume in die Jensen's Gradiva, Dreams and Illusions in Jensen's Gradiva. And those of you who have read it will probably have read it using this edition, although there are plenty of other editions. And then at the end, if there is time, I want to have a quick look at how this type of thinking, psychoanalysis, can be compared with other theories, with other critical theories such as Marxism and structuralism. Okay? Now, before we start, and please be honest about this because I won't be angry with you about this, who has actually read the text? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, oh, that's pretty good. Okay, so we'll probably do a quick summary of the story of the novella that Freud interprets anyway. And has anyone read anything else apart or in addition to the text, like my book or any other books on Freud?
Yes,
a long time. Okay, fair enough. Right, so when I said I want to talk about psychoanalysis in general, I really mean classical Freudian psychoanalysis. So the psychoanalytic theories of Sigmund Freud. Of course, after Freud there came a whole number of so-called neo-Freudians, people who developed Freud's ideas in new directions, linking his theories, for example, with structuralism. That's what the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan did. He's there on the whiteboard, born 1901, died 1981. So Lacan offers a combination of structuralism and Freudian psychoanalysis. In that sense, Lacan is a neo-Freudian, a post-Freudian, although Lacan himself, Lacan always described himself as saying, no, I'm not actually a post-Freudian, I'm a Freudian. Okay. Another important thinker, probably together with Freud, the most important other psychologist of the 20th century is Carl Gustav Jung, who started off as a pupil of Freud's and was a colleague of him, but then around 1912, 1913 broke with Freud and went on to develop his own theory of psychoanalysis, which Jung called analytic psychology. But as I say, I don't want to talk about Lacan, I don't want to talk about Carl Gustav Jung, I don't want to talk about any of the other major post-Freudian thinkers. I want to focus on Freud's own ideas. I want to focus on classical Freudian psychoanalysis. Now, Freud himself, let's do a very quick biographical overview of Freud. His dates are there on the whiteboard. Born 1856, died 1939. Freud was born in a little town in what is now the Czech Republic, and at the time that he was born was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. When he was about 4 years old, Freud and his parents moved to Vienna, where Freud lived basically all his life until the very end, 1938. In 1938, the Germans invaded Austria. And Freud wasn't a big fan of the Germans, of the Nazis. Freud was Jewish, and Freud knew that he didn't have much longer to live, because by then he had been suffering from cancer for quite a long time, cancer of the jaw, because he was always smoking these horrible cigars. So Freud knew, I will die soon, but he said, I want to die in freedom. So in 1938, Freud moved to London, where he then did indeed die the year after in 1939. So pretty much his entire life Freud lived and worked in Vienna, and this is also where he developed his theory of psychoanalysis. Now there are 2 or 3 core concepts to classical Freudian psychoanalysis. Do you know what they are? If I asked you, those of you who know a little bit about Freud, what are the, let's say, the 2 key concepts about Freudian psychoanalysis?
The conscious and unconscious?
Right, one is the unconscious and the other one is the concept of sexuality that Freud uses. There is a third concept that I'll come to in a moment. So Freud studied medicine, and his medical education was what was called positivistic. So what's positivism? Does anyone know this?
It's related to verifiable facts or observable facts, maybe?
Yeah, that's right. So positivism, very popular in the second half of the 19th century, is the idea that the only properly scientific study of phenomena is a study of things that are measurable, that are quantifiable. So stuff that you can actually see it with the naked eye, see it with a microscope, see it with a telescope, you can weigh it, you can, I was going to say touch it, that's perhaps an overstatement, but positivism is the view that science should consist in the methodical interrelating of objectively given, verifiable, measurable, quantifiable facts, and everything else, positivists say, is, well, maybe it's mysticism, maybe it's literature, maybe it's art, but it's certainly not science, it's not scientific. So if you apply that to the study of mental processes, what you get is that mental processes are reduced to processes in the brain. They are biological, chemical processes. And that is the tradition that Freud was educated in. He had a number of famous teachers, such as Ernst Wilhelm von Brücke, Theodor Meinert, the names are mentioned in my book, and down. These were Freud's most important professors. And Wilhelm von Brücke in particular had a very strong influence on Freud, and they were positivists. So to them, the mind was essentially identical to the brain. Studying the mind means studying the chemical, biological, physical processes in the brain. And the first step that Freud takes towards psychoanalysis is that he moves away from that. That Freud says, actually there is an autonomy to mental processes that isn't reducible to physiological, biological, chemical processes. So when we talk about things like love or hatred and desire and fantasizing, and the way we do that in the interaction with the outside world, that isn't reducible to anything medical, to anything physiological. There is more to the brain, well, there is more to these two mental processes than just the brain. And Freud got his first inkling of that when he was working together with people such as Jean-Martin Charcot, who worked at the Salpêtrière in Paris. Freud did I think what we would call work placement there, and Jean-Martin Charcot was the most famous doctor of the Salpêtrière at the time. Salpêtrière, the famous mental asylum or hospital for people with psychological problems in Paris. And Charcot worked with hypnosis among other things, so that other people can influence your mental processes without there being any physiological or biological chemistry being involved. And this gave Freud the idea that maybe there is an autonomy to mental processes that makes it important that we study mental processes in their interaction and not try to reduce them to, as I said earlier, to biology. So that's the first step that Freud takes, and all this takes place between, say, 1890 and 1900, the move away from the brain to the mind, the move from neurology to psychology. Tell me if I'm going too quickly. I know I have a tendency to speak too quickly. On the other hand, I always say the same things 2 or 3 times. So that's the first step that Freud takes, the step from neurology to psychology. And then the second step he takes is from psychology to psychoanalysis. And there, as we said earlier, there are 2 concepts that are central. First of all, the unconscious, and secondly, sexuality. So the first key psychoanalytic concept is that of the unconscious, which is the idea that everything we do, everything we say, everything we think is driven, is determined, is influenced, is steered, is affected not just by what we consciously desire, but also by unconscious desires, by desires that we are not aware of. And desires and wishes and fears and intentions that we cannot call to mind even if we're trying to. So Freud talks about the conscious and then the unconscious, and he has a third category as well, which is what he calls pre-conscious. So conscious is everything that we're thinking of. So right now you are thinking of, you're conscious of hopefully you're conscious of what I'm saying. Okay? At the same time you're conscious of desperately having to go to the loo, or you're thinking of, God, this is incredibly boring, I've got no idea why I chose this course on critical theory, it's a complete waste of time. You're all conscious of that. Then there's stuff that is pre-conscious, in the sense that you're just not thinking about it, but you can call it to mind anytime you want to. So right now you're not thinking of your phone number, you're not thinking of the address that you're living at. Of course, the moment I say this, you do become conscious of it, okay? But you're not thinking of your telephone number, you're not thinking of the wonderful holiday you had last year, whatever. But this is stuff that you can call to mind anytime. That's why it's pre-conscious. So pre-consciousness is essentially a form of consciousness. And then there's stuff that we cannot call to mind even if we try. That is the unconscious. And Freud very specifically says, this is my phrase, the unconscious. It's not subconscious. When people talk about Freud, they say this a lot. Okay? They say stuff like, as Freud would have said, I did it subconsciously, or it was a subconscious mistake. But Freud says, later on in his life he never uses the term. In the early, still in the late 19th century, between 1890 and 1900, he does use the term subconscious, but then he says actually this is not really the right term, because subconscious sounds like a region in the mind or a region in the brain, just like the word subcutaneous injection. Subcutaneous means below the skin surface. So if you say subconscious, it's a bit like my conscious is on top and below that is the subconscious. But Freud says the unconscious is not a place, it has no location. The unconscious is a process. So it's far better, that's a bit cumbersome, but it's far better to talk about conscious processes and unconscious processes. And at any given time, Freud says, the mind of any given person, the mind is an interplay of conscious and unconscious processes. So right now, as I said earlier, there's conscious processes going through your mind, and there's also unconscious processes working on you. Okay, and on me as well. What they are we don't know, that's why they are unconscious, but they're constantly trying to manifest itself. So, in that sense, the other important thing about the unconscious is that it is always split. On the one hand, the unconscious is all these desires and wishes and fears that we have, and I'll say a little bit about that in a moment. All these desires and wishes and fears that we have and that are pushing for consciousness, trying to become conscious. But there, at the same time, there is a sort of unconscious or equally unconscious counter movement trying to push these wishes and desires back. And that brings us to the question, what is in the unconscious? What is the unconscious made of? And as I said here, Freud gives the answer, it's basically desires. A bit later in his life he will become a little bit more nuanced about this and say, well, it's also fears and worries and other preoccupations and so on. But the essence of the unconscious is desire. And Freud says the essence of the unconscious is sexual desire. So that's the second key concept of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is the idea that man is ruled to a large extent by mental processes of which he is unaware, that are unconscious, and these processes are sexual in nature. Now that seems like a big statement, which it is, but it's important to see here that Freud uses the word sexual and sexuality in a wider sense than we're used to using it. So Freud's concept of sexual is basically anything that gives us pleasure. Anything that gives us pleasurable feelings is sexual. So not only sexual intercourse and masturbation, but also, for example, the good feeling that we can have when we go into the shop. There's this really incompetent shopkeeper, and we want to shout at this person and say, "You stupid," and so on. Okay, and letting go like that can be a really good feeling. Or, of course, we don't do this, especially not only most of us are foreigners here, but especially if we're British, we don't do this because then we're always very polite. So we repress this stuff, or we try and forget about it. But we think about doing this. Okay. Or we go home and we think, this is what I should have done. You know, very often when we're in a discussion with someone and we lose the discussion, or someone says something not so nice to us and we want to say something back, but of course the moment that that's happening, this really good repartee, this really good answer doesn't come to us, it comes to us later, and what we then do is when we're at home, in our minds, we play the same scene over and over again without saying this thing, this is what I should have said. I should have told them this or that. Okay? And the pleasure that comes from that, according to Freud, is also sexual. So anything that gives us pleasure, both sexual in a more narrow sense, or aggression, or thinking about this, or fantasizing, and so on. And when talking about these sexual urges, Freud uses the words, the German word Triebe, and Trieb means something like drive. And if you look at the English translation of Freud's text, then they translate Trieb with instinct. Okay, but this is very misleading. Because an instinct, and now we come back to the concept of the unconscious as a process rather than the subconscious as a sort of region or locality in the brain. An instinct is fixed and immutable. So birds have an instinct to migrate to a warmer climate, and they will always do that. There is no way a bird is not going to migrate to a warmer climate in winter. Okay? So instincts are pre-given and unchangeable. That's why the translation of treat with instinct is misleading, because one of the key things about Freudian psychology is precisely that these triebe are changeable. They sometimes occur, sometimes don't occur. They can be changed into their opposite. They can be directed at one thing and then, as Freud calls it, be displaced to something else. You can project your own drives onto someone else. Let's take a few examples of that. I hope I'm not taking up too much time. I always do, because I've been talking about psychoanalysis for ages, and we do have to get to this text, and we will. Okay, so let's take some typical Freudian concepts. Projection, some displacement, reaction, the key Freudian term is, of course, repression. For those who have German, this is, of course, Verdrängung. Refoulement is a French word. So again, this is something that animals can't do. A bird can't repress its instinct to migrate to a warm climate. Okay, but we can repress our desires, says Freud. Okay? We can also displace the feelings we have towards something or towards someone onto someone else. Okay, so. A man works for a company, is working for a company, he's got a really, really horrible boss, and he wants to shout at his boss and say, you know, to the boss, you're always bullying me, you're a horrible boss, basically you're an arsehole. But of course the person can't say that to his boss, because then he might be sacked. Okay, so he's got all this aggression in him, directed at this boss, because the boss is the one that he's angry with, but he can't get rid of that aggression vis-a-vis his boss, because he's afraid that he then might lose his job. So then he goes home, and again his wife hasn't done the dishes, and then he starts shouting at his wife and saying, you're a useless person, why haven't you not done the dishes, you never do anything at all. So what happens there is that he takes out on his wife the anger that he really feels towards his boss. So he has displaced that emotion from his boss onto his wife. Okay, another example is projection. Say you've got a happily married man. I apologize, the examples are slightly cliched, okay, but it's a bit easier. It's a bit easier like that. So you've got a happily married man, very much in love with his wife, but then he meets this other woman and he really fancies her. Okay, he kind of falls in love with her. Now, for that man, that's not a great feeling to have, because you know he's married, so he shouldn't desire another woman. And he feels embarrassed by this. Now, the easiest way would probably be just to repress that desire that he has, but repression is a difficult thing to do. It doesn't always work, especially if the emotion is very, very strong. So that causes stress on the brain or on the mind. And then one way of dealing with that is that you then project your own desire onto that other person. So instead of saying, I love Mary, your brain then tricks you into believing Mary loves me. Okay? So, I love Mary. This is what you initially really feel, but you know it's antisocial and immoral and not good because you're married to Jane. Therefore, your brain then, your mind rather, projects the feeling of love onto Mary, and then that becomes Mary fancies me. And that then has the advantage of course in inverted commas, that then has the advantage that now he can say, well actually, you know, yes, I slept with Mary, but hey, it wasn't really my fault, she came on to me. Okay? So, I know it's a dubious way of explaining things and dealing with responsibilities and so on, but that's psychologically, for some people anyway, this is much more comforting. Okay? You really didn't do anything wrong, okay, you were weak, but it kind of happened to you. Okay? We have the same kind of projection also with negative feelings, feelings of hatred. So lots of people say things like, I don't have a problem with John, it's John who has a problem with me. Okay, of course you do have a problem with John, okay? But you ascribe the feelings of aggression, which are negative feelings, which you are embarrassed, you ascribe those feelings to that other person. Okay, and then finally, reaction formation. The German word is Reaktionsbildung. Reaction formation is when a feeling that you have is so strong that you're not able to repress it, you're not really able to displace or project it either, and what the mind then does is that tricks you into believing that the emotion that you're feeling is actually the opposite, the exact opposite of the emotion that you actually have. So you really, really love someone, but for some reason or other you know it's not going to work out, you can't have that person, and then I love that person is translated or transformed into I hate that person. Okay, the example that I always use, but it's a bit tricky because it shows my age, and I don't know, whether you know the series or not. The example that I always use is Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Who's seen Buffy the Vampire Slayer? Okay, good, enough people have, very good. So Buffy fancies Spike, okay, but this is problematic because Buffy is a vampire slayer, a vampire killer, and Spike's a vampire. So Buffy can't love Spike, okay, but she does love him. So that is then, so her mind then tricks her into believing I hate Spike. Spike is the most horrible person ever. I could kill Spike. Okay, but it's really love that she's feeling towards him, and that then in season 3 or 4, whatever, it becomes clear that that is the case because then actually they do fall in love. Okay, so it's almost like you go into a shop. And there was this really, really horrible shop assistant working there, and you want to shout at this person. It sounds like I constantly have negative experience with shops in Britain. You want to, you are in danger of getting really, really aggressive to this person, and you know the only way I can get rid of my homicidal tendencies towards that person is by being super, super polite and correct, okay? Because you know the moment you enter into a discussion with that person, you will get really aggressive. So the aggression that you feel is transformed into super correctness, okay? And the same thing happens with emotions such as love, hate, and other desires and fears and so on that people have, or may have happen anyway. So, key constituent of, or the key component of Freudian psychoanalysis, first of all, the unconscious. Second, sexuality in the extended sense. And then thirdly, the fact that if you put those two things together, what you have is a dynamic vision of human interaction. Interaction which always takes place in a specific social environment. The desires and wishes and fears that we have are always desires and wishes and fears that are to do with what we can and cannot do in a specific, historically concrete society. And how we then behave and what we then think takes place in the interaction with other people. Okay, talking about psychoanalysis like this, it becomes clear how easy it is, and how this is already implied in many ways in psychoanalysis, how easy it is to link this to sociology, or for example to a theory such as Marxism. Freud's psychology is really a social psychology right from the start, because it is about man in his interaction with other human beings. Okay? You displace the anger that you feel towards your boss because socially it isn't possible to have, to beat up your boss or to have a discussion with him or whatever. How much we might want to do, sometimes might want to do that. Okay. And maybe I should mention a fourth principle of psychoanalysis. So the first one, classical Freudian psychoanalysis, the first one, the unconscious, as in a process, a mental process. The second one, sexuality. The third one, the view of psychoanalysis as a dynamic psychology, as a social psychology. And then the fourth one, Freud's idea, so I said at the beginning, I think that I mentioned 3 points, I'll give you an additional one, 4 items. The fourth one is that all these desires and wishes and fears that we have, and that we try to hide not only from other people but also from ourselves, because what is unconscious is also unknown to us, so we're hiding it from ourselves. Whatever we try and hide from ourselves, and whatever we repress, and even if we repress really, really successfully, these wishes, these desires, these fears that we have will always come back. There is no way that repression is ever going to be 100% successful. What we repress will always remain in the unconscious, and because the unconscious is a process, these wishes, desires and fears will always try and manifest themselves. So they will always come out in some form or other. This is why Freud says, a famous quotation by Freud, he who has eyes to hear and ears to see, he who has eyes to see and ears to hear becomes convinced that mortals can keep no secret. If their lips are silent, they gossip with their fingertips. Betrayal forces its way through every pore. Okay, so the unconscious will always manifest itself. When I do the Freud course with my students, of course I have my second year Freud course with students, undergraduate course, I always start off by showing a clip from Darren Brown. Darren Brown is this magician stroke mentalist, where he asks people to say 5 things. For example, he has a group of car dealers and he says, so there's a car that you've just sold, tell me 5 things about that car, but you lie on one of these things. So about speed or whatever it may be, the buyer, how expensive the car is and so on. Tell me 5 things about this car, but lie on one of them. And these people do, they tell him 5 things, and Darren Brown says, you lied on the 3rd one. Okay? And he can see that they're lying because they get nervous, because lying produces stress, as we all know. So then their eyes start blinking, for example, or they start sweating a little bit, or whatever it may be. Okay? Some of you may have seen one of these two, or maybe both of them, TV series. Lie to Me, starring Tim Roth, which is about a psychologist who works for the FBI, I think, and who's a lie catcher, sort of a human lie detector, because he pays attention to people sweating and waving with their hands, or slight incongruities and inconsistencies in the language they use, and so on. and the other one is The Mentalist, which is on Channel 5, starring Simon Baker. He does kind of the same. He does the same thing. So I show this clip, the Einbahn clip, to my students, and then I say, what Freud says is that the same tensions, the same little symptoms of lying, of repression, of hiding things, they become visible not only when people are lying and trying to hide things from other people, but also when you're trying to hide something from yourself. When you repress things that you yourself, your conscious personality, doesn't want to know about these antisocial desires and fears and so on that you may have. So you repress them, you put them away in your unconscious, so that even you are no longer aware of them, but they will still show themselves in little. They will come back in some form or other, and we will see how that is the case with this story as well. Okay, so that's how psychoanalysis works in general, classical Freudian psychoanalysis. The two names, I got rid of them now, the two names that I mentioned earlier, Carl Gustav Jung and Jacques Lacan, differ from Freud to a large extent in that they have a different conception of the unconscious. Carl Gustav Jung, as you may know, came up with the concept of a collective unconscious, so the idea that it's not only the case that I have my own repressed things and you have your repressed things and you have your repressed things, meaning I have an unconscious, you have an unconscious which is different and so on. Jung says there is an unconscious which is typical to all mankind, and he develops his theory from there. Lacan says that the unconscious is to a large extent not the animalistic drives in man, but the cultural, social wishes and fears and desires and preoccupations that we have. So, and these, Lacan says, are to do with language in the extended sense of a symbolic order. So each language, each symbolic order, each social discourse has its own regulations, its own prohibitions, its own prejudices, its own ideologies and so on. And when we are born, we unconsciously take over these social regulations, prohibitions and so on. And we are not aware of them because we're not able to, or at least it's very hard to take a step back from them and reflect on them, because they seem naturally given. Okay, so I don't know, if you take, you grow up around 1700 or 1800 or even 1900, the distribution of roles between men and women was obvious. Okay, men would work, women would be at home, have children, take care of the food and so on. No one, quite well, just like I was telling you, very few people questioned that. That was just how it was. Okay, just like when you grow up in a society with slavery, it seems perfectly natural to have people who are masters and people who are slaves. But these are social prejudices that become part of people's mindset without people being aware of it. And that's what Lacan focuses on. Okay, but I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about Lacan, who, in addition to what I've just said, has also said probably a lot of nonsense. Let's move on now to psychoanalytic literary criticism. Am I going too quickly? I know I have this tendency to speak quickly. Now if I'm going too slowly, or if it's too superficial, okay? I was going to say, actually I forgot, I was going to say that I don't know whether you looked at the text for next time, which is about hermeneutics. There's a text by Gadamer and a text by French, I think, Paul Ricoeur. Those texts, especially the one by Gadamer, is a heck of a lot more difficult than Freud. Okay, that's a really challenging text. So we're starting off in a relatively straightforward manner, and then things will become more complex along the way. So if you're bored now and think, gosh, this is all a lot of, I know all this or whatever. If first of all, then tell me, okay, then I can do other stuff. But also, this deliberate decision on my part to start sort of at a relatively sort of low, straightforward level, and then take things a bit further. Because when we look at hermeneutics, we'll also come back to Freud. Okay, Freud and psychoanalysis as applied to literature. Simplifying, there are three ways in which we can do this, apply Freud's ideas to literature. First of all, this is a text, say Gradiva, okay, that has characters in it who interact with each other, and psychoanalysis can, psychoanalytic criticism can analyze the behavior and the thoughts and prejudices and all the rest of it of the characters in a play or a novel or a poem from the perspective of Freudian psychoanalysis. That is to say, starting from the idea that whatever we do, whatever we say is determined not only by what we consciously want to do and consciously want to say, but also by what we unconsciously want to do. Okay, so our unconscious pushes us in a certain direction, to take certain actions, to say certain things, and so on. Now, you could say that seems rather strange to try and analyze or interpret the unconscious of literary characters, because literary characters aren't real. So how can you know anything about their unconscious? What would a Freudian reply to that potential criticism?
The writer is writing unconsciously.
Yeah, okay.
So he's just depicting real life.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually the writer's unconscious, subconscious.
Yeah, so
He's
that
actually giving that.
that's part of it as well. So writers are usually unhappy people. So
Can maybe say that.
So
Sorry.
yeah, so we can look at the text as the outcome of mental processes that are on the part of the writer both conscious. So the writer has given the text a specific structure, the writer has specific ideas about the character of the protagonists and so on, but the writer is also pushed to writing these texts by the writer's unconscious desires. Okay, and we can psychoanalyze the writer in many cases because he or she is a real, actually living person, either still alive or someone who's dead. But if he's dead, then we have his letters and maybe biographies or documents about his life and so on. But coming back to saying something about the unconscious of literary characters, so the unconscious of people that aren't really, that aren't alive. I don't know if you were going to say something about that.
Maybe the unconscious manifests itself in language. It's present in language always, even if it's not real. It's there in fiction or text.
True, but how can you talk about the unconscious of literary characters?
Yeah, I'll just come back to that the unconscious might be language, but yeah.
Is it to do with the unconscious manifesting itself in interactions and the dynamic?
Yeah, that's what Adonis is saying as well. Okay. And I think and that's true. I think what a Freudian would also say to that is, these characters, literary characters, are meant to be real characters in most cases anyway. Real living persons. That's why the writer wrote about them. That's why we are interested in them. So we want to know why they do something, and then we inevitably speculate about motives and about what they want. So we also speculate about their conscious desires and fears and so on. In other words, that's what literary critics always do. So why not then also speculate about their unconscious motives? If these people or characters in the novel are supposed to be real people, then we've got to treat them as real people. And then it's no good to say, well, they are not real people, so you can't speculate about their unconscious. Because if that were the case, then by the same token, you could also not speculate about their conscious desires. Okay? So literary critics in that sense can't have it both ways. And it's true, that's absolutely right, but then you speculate about their unconscious on the basis of their actions and words and phrases and so on that they say in the novel or in the play. So we can look at, let's take a classic example, because Freud's first remarks on literature are to be found in his book, The Interpretation of Dreams, Die Traumdeutung. The Interpretation of Dreams is the first big book, and it is a big book, it's 600 or 700, 800 pages. The first big book that Freud published, where you have all the key elements of psychoanalysis, all the core elements of psychoanalysis are in that book. And it's the first book that Freud published that has all these elements. He published it in 1899, published put the date 1900 in the book, just to make the book look more modern, of course. And in the Interpretation of Dreams, Freud says several things about literature, including Shakespeare's Hamlet. And then later, Freud's pupil and later biographer Ernest Jones, extended these few remarks that Freud made about Hamlet into a book called Hamlet and Oedipus, first published in 1910, I think, or first in an article 1910 and then later in a book. So let's say this is Hamlet. Okay, this is the play Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet, published 1604. And then you can analyze the behavior or Hamlet's relationship with his mother, Gertrude, with his fiancée, Ophelia, with his uncle, Claudius, and so on, from a psychoanalytic perspective. So why does Hamlet say these things to Ophelia? Why does Ophelia say these things to Hamlet? You analyze that not just on the basis of the conscious, but also on the basis of the unconscious motivations. But you can also then try and interpret Hamlet as the result of unconscious processes, or as an interaction between conscious and unconscious processes in Shakespeare. So psychoanalytic literary criticism gives you an interpretation of the play and the characters, but also an interpretation of the author, and finally also the reader, so us as readers. Okay? You make us happy because we like Hamlet and we think it's a good play. Okay? So psychoanalysis can also say something about our reactions as readers. Why is it that it is Hamlet that has become such a... Why is Hamlet Shakespeare's most famous play, even though it's probably in some ways not as good a play as some of other Shakespeare's plays? There are really funny, strange things happen in Hamlet, which there's no real... There seems to be no... That seems to make very little sense. So Hamlet wants to kill Claudius. Claudius is hiding... He thinks that Claudius... Well, he says that he thinks that Claudius is hiding behind a curtain or something like that. That's strange enough in itself, because Hamlet has just seen Claudius praying somewhere else, so he should know that this isn't Claudius, but he says to himself, this must be Claudius. He takes out his sword and stabs the guy, and then he goes, oh my god, it's not Claudius, it's Polonius. Oh well, and then he just seems to move on without being touched by this in any way, which is just makes very little sense. So again, Hamlet is a weird play, and still it's Shakespeare's most popular play. So why is that? Why are readers so taken with this play? Well, Freud says, and Ernest Jones says, if we apply psychoanalysis to this, then we can find more about that. But that's not what I want to talk about today. Okay, let us move on to the text for today. Does anyone want to take a short break? Go to the toilet or 5-minute break?
Yeah.
Sorry? No? Okay, then let's move on. Okay, so the text for today is called Dreams and Delusions in Jensen's Gradiva. Or Delusions and Dreams. So the two. So Freud gives an interpretation of a story written by Wilhelm Jensen. The story is written in 1903, or was written as a novella. It was written in 1903, and Freud's book or text on this was published in 1907. Delusion and Dreams in Jensen's Gradiva, and Freud then points to two aspects in the story: the delusions and obviously the dreams. And I want to start with the illusions and then with the delusions, and then we move on to the dreams in a moment. Okay. Before we do that, let's just remind ourselves of what happens in the story. So, what's the name of the main character? Arnold, Robert Arnold. And what does he do professionally? He is an archaeologist, that's right. And at the beginning of the story he's bought in German it's called a relief, so a relief, which is a carving or stamping in stone. Well, actually he's bought a plaster cast of it, and it actually photocopy that for you. It looks like this. So this is what he... That's two, I think. That's three. This is what he buys. It's also the pictures also in the book. And he gives this picture the name of Gradiva. Well, he gives the woman in the picture the name of Gradiva, which literally means something like she who steps forward. And he does that because she walks in this kind of funny way. Monty Python silly walk kind of. She walks in this weird way, he says, and that's what he seems to be attracted to. And that's what he's fascinated by, and that's why he buys this carving or stamping in stone. And what is what he then wants to find out when he's bought this, and she walks in this silly way, and then he wonders what. He then says, does anyone really walk like this? So he then starts doing sort of, observations. He goes out into the street, begins to staring at women, trying to find out whether any of them actually, have this particular gait.
For the first time.
Sorry?
For the first time, because before he wasn't interested in demons.
Yeah. So how do the women react to his looking at them?
It was a sexual harassment, maybe.
Yeah, that's right. So some of them don't notice, and some of the others, feel harassed, as you say, and Some of the others seem to quite like it and sort of come on to him a bit, but he doesn't notice any of that. Okay. And whilst he's doing these observations, then he goes home and he has a dream. Okay, we'll need to look at the dream a bit later. It's a dream about the eruption of the Vesuvius. I've also photocopied this. I know most of you will have the book, but this is quicker. This is 3 there. 1, 2. Then maybe you can just read it to us. We'll come back to it later.
Read it out.
Just read it out loud.
Okay. Norbert Hamel's delusion, as I was saying, was carried a step further by a dream which occurred in the middle of his efforts to discover a gate like Grada's in the streets of the town where he lived. It is easy to give the content of this dream in brief. The dreamer found himself in Pompeii on the day on which that unhappy city was destroyed and experienced its horrors without being in danger himself. He suddenly saw Grada stepping along there and understood all at once, as though it was something quite natural, that since she was at Pompeii and she was living in a native town, and without his having suspected it, living as his contemporary. He was seized with fear on her account and gave a warning cry, whereupon she turned her face towards him for a moment. But she proceeded on her way without paying any attention to him, lay down on the steps of the temple of Apollo, and was buried in the rain of ashes after her face had lost its colour, as though it were turning into white marble, until it had become just like a piece of sculpture. As he was waking up, he interpreted the noises of a big city penetrating into his bedroom as the cries for help of the despairing inhabitants of Pompeii and the thunder of the wildly agitated sea. The feeling that what he had dreamt had really happened to him would not leave him for some time after he had woken, and the conviction that Grada had lived in Pompeii and perished there on the fatal day was left over with him by the dream as a fresh starting point for his delusion.
Yeah, so this is the eruption of the Vesuvius in, 79. The films about this, I think very recently was filmed about this, and he has this dream. We'll look at what the dream means later on. He has this dream, then he wakes up, then he looks out of the window, and he says to himself, "There's Gradiva, there's the woman that I bought this thing of." He then immediately rushes out, goes after her, but loses track of her, and also people around him are looking at him in a funny way because he's still in his pyjamas. So then he goes back, and then he suddenly decides to go to Italy. We're not sure why. He tells himself this is for scientific reasons, for archaeological reasons, but he goes to Italy. So he convinces himself that he's got to look at some important statues in Rome. So he goes to Rome, then he goes to Naples, then he considers going to Capri and decides against it. Why is this?
It's a hot spot for honeymooning couples.
That's right, there are all these couples that are just married, they're all going to Capri and they're kissing all the time. He's rather put off by it. So he goes to Pompeii instead, and then in Pompeii he sees Gradiva. And I don't know how you read the story, but when I was reading the story, it's slightly weird, and you don't know what kind of, this is what I don't know, you don't know what kind of story you're reading. You say to yourself, is this guy hallucinating, or is this some sort of horror story, sort of a ghost story, and maybe she is a real ghost? As a reader, you don't know. So Hamlet follows her. Then he gets a hold of her and he speaks to her. Now he thinks that she's Greek, so he addresses her in Greek, okay, classical Greek. He's an archaeologist and educated people in the 19th century, so he tries Greek, which he doesn't understand. Then he switches to Latin, which he also doesn't understand, but she answers back in German. And then it's becoming clear to the reader that actually this probably is a real living woman. But Norbert himself is still deluded. He still thinks that this woman is somehow this statue come to life. They then say goodbye to each other, but the next day or whenever it is they meet again, and she tells him, my real name is Zoe. And at that point it becomes clear to the reader that she knows that he's hallucinating and that she's kind of deliberately playing along with his delusions, with his hallucinations, in order to cure him of these hallucinations. Then, just before he meets her again, he sees another couple, and at first he thinks, oh, there must be brother and sister. That's what he assumes, but then they're kissing and he realizes actually they're one of these couples that have just got married, but now he is no longer put off by her. He then meets Gradiva again and find out that actually she is a real person. There's a fly on her leg or whatever, and he then touches, he chases away the fly, and at the same time he touches her. She addresses him by his real name, Norbert, so apparently she knows him. And the couple that he saw the day before and that he thought were brother and sister, and they turn out to be good friends of Zoe's. So Norbert's delusions are slowly vanishing, and then at the end of the story you have the riddle of the solution to the riddle, which is that actually Zoe is is a childhood friend of Norbert's. So they were playmates when they were children. Her real name is Zoe Bertgang. Her father is a professor of zoology. She has always known Norbert, and she's again played along with his delusions in order to cure him. He now suddenly recognizes, his delusions have now disappeared, he recognizes her as his old friend. He realizes that he's in love with her, that he's always been in love with her, and she's always been in love with him, so then they decide to get married. End of story. Okay, that's also what it ends well. That's the story. And that's where Freud's interpretation starts. And let's start with what Freud says about her. So, Freud's then, there's not really anything about Zoe's youth and childhood and Norbert's youth and childhood in the book, in the novella, as Jensen wrote it. So Freud then starts speculating about this. And he says, what happened is this: like all girls, Zoe originally fell in love with her father. Okay, this is the famous or infamous Freudian Oedipus complex. A slightly weird sounding theory that Freud has, which is that all children initially fall in love with their parents. Now, just like with the word sexuality, and now also with the word falling in love, Freud doesn't mean falling in love with your parents in the same way that you, when you're, I don't know, 18 or 20, or can fall in love with someone else. Freud certainly doesn't mean that all children secretly desire to have sexual intercourse with their parents or something like that. And Freud says children fall in love with their parents. What he basically means is they want to have the exclusive attention of the other parent. So a little girl wants to have the exclusive attention of the father, and the mother is just in the way because the little girl wants to be with the father, but then the father is constantly with the mother. So the little girl starts having negative feelings towards the mother and wants the mother just out of the way, gone. And the little boy wants to have sort of the exclusive attention of the mother, and therefore the little boy starts developing negative feelings towards the father. We can come back to this later. This is obviously in many ways very problematical theory. But anyway, that's what Freud said. So Zoe initially fell in love with her father, but he was a scientist, a professor of zoology, and basically only interested in his work. Okay? He was a workaholic. So he didn't have much time for Zoe, and then Zoe then displaced her desire towards her father onto Norbert. So she kind of falls in love with Norbert. But then Norbert, very quickly and early on, turns into some sort of egghead, you know, becoming very interested in archaeology, so he's a nerd, okay? Now, why does this not put, so you would think, you know, so this guy is a nerd, you know, leave him, ditch him, you know, but she becomes, that's not the case, and why is that?
She was very intelligent. She knew that actually, she works as a psychologist. So she actually cured him, and
Yeah,
she
but,
knew that she can cure him.
yeah, but I mean, this is when they were still very young. So why is Zoe not put off by the fact that he's a nerd and basically not really interested in her?
Norbert resembles her father.
Because now Norbert is even more like her father, absolutely. So she wants to be with her father, who's an archaeologist and an academic and basically a nerd as well. Then she becomes interested in Norbert, but then Norbert himself becomes very nerdy, but this only heightens Zoe's fascination for Norbert. And she wants to be with him. But then that doesn't work out because he doesn't want her. I will come on to him in a moment. But she wants him. She's never really lost that feeling or those feelings for him. So when they later meet in Pompeii, and it looks like, or she finds out that he's actually also interested in her, she then immediately tries to cure him of his delusion so that they can get married. Okay, so this is how things work with Zoe, according to Freud, and you know that's relatively straightforward. The situation with Norbert is slightly more complicated. He is interested in Zoe, he becomes interested in Zoe when they're young, but he sort of can't handle those feelings, isn't ready for this yet, so he represses this, what Freud says, he represses his desire for her. And the way he does that isn't simply repression. What he does is he sublimates his sexual desire. What is sublimation?
To turn into something else, almost transfer onto something else.
And to transform sexual desire into something else, but this something else is
His job.
in this concrete case is its job. And generally speaking, sublimation is when you convert sexual energy into something which is socially more acceptable. So, I don't know, instead of spying on your attractive next door neighbour, you read the Playboy, okay? And then you say you read the Playboy for the interview. So so almost the elevation in a sense, or the transformation of animalistic sexual desire, which can be antisocial, you desire someone but they're already married or whatever, that is then converted into something socially more acceptable. And in the case of Norbert, as you say, absolutely right, in the case of Norbert what he does is he sublimates his sexual desire for Zoe into his work, into archaeology. Okay, sexual desire is converted into archaeology. You can see how that might work, you know, archaeologists always entering these dark wet holes and so on. But, Freud says, and then Freud was an educated man as well, then he uses this Latin phrase, Naturam foca expellas tamen usque recurret. Those who've seen, have read the English version will have seen that this is actually misquoted in the Freud misquotes this in the German version. So it's a famous quotation that you may have heard in English. You can throw out nature with a pitchfork, yet it'll always keep coming back. So we can try and throw out nature with a pitchfork, yet it will always keep coming back. So this is the Darren Brown thing, okay, or the lie to me or the mentalist thing. And whatever we repress, it will always find a way back. What we repress are these sexual animalistic desires, hence nature. But however hard we try and throw out these desires and get rid of them by repressing them, they will always keep coming back. They will find a way back into our lives. And Freud says the way that happens, and this is a quotation from the Penguin Freud Library on page 60. This is a key sentence. One of my favourite undergraduate exam questions. It is. Freud says, the very thing that he used as the vehicle of the repression, so as the instrument of repression, becomes the vehicle for the return of the repressed. It is precisely what was chosen as the instrument of repression that becomes the vehicle for the return of the repressed. How does that work? What is the instrument? What is Norbert Harnold's instrument of repression?
His archaeological work.
His archaeological work. And how does his archaeological work then become? So this is. How does the archaeological work become then a vehicle for the return of the repressed through what?
Through this relief and the subsequent fascination
absolutely. Through this thing, yeah. So he turns away from Zoe and from sexual desire towards archaeology, but then through archaeology, through this, he then finds his way back to Zoe. Absolutely. And that is the case because this relief actually unconsciously reminds him of Zoe. And he gives it the name Gradiva, and Freud says that the word Zoe's surname Berggang or Berggang also means, coming from Middle High German, apparently also means something, stepping along, stepping forward, and Gradiva also means she who steps forward or who steps along, something like that. And that, Freud says, is how we can understand this slightly weird story about Norbert's delusions. That's where Norbert delusions come from, and that's where his cure then also comes from, because then Zoe tries to cure him, and so on. Okay, now before we discuss this, let's have a look at this. This is the dream. Now, according to Freud, why do people dream? Let's talk about dreams in general first, or dreams from a Freudian perspective. Why do we dream?
That's the fulfillment of the wishes.
That's right. So, and why do we dream about fulfillment of wishes? Why don't we just fulfill these wishes?
Because in reality we can't.
Because that's right. Because in reality, very often we can't. So we have got all these aggressive sexual wishes that we would like to act on, but we can't.
Just let me say some of it. There's a nice quote where it says when we go to sleep, we take off a cloak of the conscious mind and put it away until we get on in the morning, so it's taken off, so that the unconscious can express itself more freely, in a sense.
That's right. That's absolutely right. So whilst we are awake, there is a very strong need to repress these urges, because when you're interacting with other people, you can't just say, I really hate that guy, let's just beat him up. Okay. So whilst we are interacting with other people, there is a very strong need to repress these things, but whilst we are asleep, there is less need to repress this stuff, because we're not interacting with other people, so there's no danger. So therefore our desires, our wishes become conscious, they enter not into waking consciousness, but into sleeping consciousness, into the consciousness of the dream. Now why don't we therefore just, because Freud says we don't, why don't we just then dream all these? Why are our dreams not full of sex and violence and killing and murder and all the other things? Why do our dreams look a lot more social very often? Not all the time, but very often.
Again, the consciousness tries to regulate it.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So what Freud talks about the superego.
So it's not acceptable for social values.
That's right. So the superego is our social conscience, not conscious, but conscience. The social conscience, and again here you can see that Freud's theory is really a form of social psychology, because the superego, Freud says, is not identical to, or doesn't have to be identical to the values that we have consciously decided to make our own. Our superego can also contain values that that we consciously don't agree with. The superego is basically the rules and precepts and ideologies that we've taken over from society when we grew up, when we were little. And this social conscience, this superego, is less active when we are dreaming, because there is less need to be careful, because we're not interacting with other people. But the social conscience, the superego, although less active, is not completely inactive, it's still working. And even in our dream, it is still telling us these desires that you have are wrong, are antisocial, you shouldn't have them, they are sinful, whatever it may be. So we have these desires, these drives, these triebe, that we can't fulfill. Therefore, we dream about them. But our superego, or our mind, distorts the desires and the drives as they really are, and that distortion, Freud says, is essentially a process of censorship. And this process Freud calls the dream work, or the German Traumarbeit, dream work. So the dream work is a kind of a mechanism that we have which translates our nasty, dirty, antisocial desires into something more innocuous, into something which seems more social, less antisocial. It censors these things. So that what a dream consists of, Freud says, is two things. The latent dream content, that's these desires, that's what we really want. And what we dream is the manifest dream content, or probably better to call this one. Freud isn't terribly systematic with his terminology, it's better to use thought. Latent dream thought is what we really desire, and the manifest dream content is the dream as we dream it. And the dream as we dream it is a distorted, that is to say, a censored version of our real wishes. And the dream work, Freud says, uses to some extent the same mechanisms that we use in real life, such as projection and displacement. So we maybe, let's stick with some cliché examples, instead of dreaming about beating up our boss, we dream about having a heated argument with our boss, okay? Because that's more socially acceptable, okay? Or if the boss is really horrible, we can dream about killing Adolf Hitler instead of dreaming about killing our boss. And then, of course, there's also symbolization, which I'm sure you're familiar with, so that anything to do with sexual activity is symbolized into something which seems less, which is less obviously sexual. Okay, so the vagina can be symbolized by receptacle-like objects. The penis can be symbolized by pointy objects, swords, guns, penetrative objects, and so on. Although Freud makes it very clear that actually the meaning of symbols is dependent on the biography of the dreamer. So the same symbol, say a pen, can have different meanings depending on different biographies of different dreamers. Okay, so for one person, the pen may indeed stand for a penis. For another person, a pen may stand for a desire, may symbolize the desire to become a writer. Or someone who's called Pen, P-E-N-N. Okay? And Freud also says, you know, sometimes you've got something which looks like a symbol, but isn't. A famous quotation ascribed to Freud, go ahead.
Sometimes the cigar is
Sometimes the cigar is a cigar, which Freud, as far as we know, never said, certainly never wrote. But it is entirely in line with his thinking. Sometimes, you know, a symbol isn't a symbol.
So
it looks like a, sorry?
if Freud believes that the symbolization is related to the biography of a person, so how you can write this book, Interpretation of Dreams? How he interprets the dreams as symbols and says this symbol means this symbol. If it's different with different cultures, different...
You mean a book that he published in 1899, The Interpretation of Dreams, or,
Yes.
or this one?
No, the one that you said it's about the interpretation.
Yeah, it's based on dreams of other people and dreams of, and his own dreams. Okay, so he writes about people he knows, whose biographies he knows.
For everyone.
Well, he said, given the biography of this dreamer, or given this biography of this dreamer, who has this dream, this symbol probably means that. But it is true, and you're absolutely right, that there is a tendency in Freud's dream book which becomes stronger over the years because Freud kept adding to the dream book. It started off as, I don't know, 500 pages, then became 600, 700, but he kept adding material to it in the various new editions. It is true that more and more Freud had a tendency to say, well, this means this and that means that. So kind of going against the thrust of his own theory. He does have that tendency, that's very true. Anyway, let's look at this one. So let's interpret this from a Freudian perspective. Freud, what's the meaning of this dream according to Freud? What is the dream? So this is Norbert Heinleit's dream, and what is it that the dream is trying to tell him? Trying to tell Norbert. What, in other words, is the latent dream thought behind what we are reading, and what we are reading is the manifest dream content.